everyone, and thank you for joining us again on the Seafood Matters. With me today is Dr. Bryce Stewart, Senior Research Fellow at the Marine Biological Association, and we are discussing Bryce's recently released report on the octopus bloom in the southwest UK. Hi Bryce, welcome back. It's a pleasure having you again on Seafood Matters podcast.
Thanks, Jim. It is great to be back here, as always.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this chat. To start, Bryce, people are calling this an octopus bloom. But for listeners who haven't maybe read the report, what actually qualifies this as a bloom rather than just perhaps a good year for octopus?
Yeah, it's a good question. This sudden increase in this particular species of octopus, which is the common octopus, is its most usually used name, Octopus vulgaris. People have called it an invasion, a plague, an outburst, and a boom and a bloom. So they are all really just descriptive phrases of a sudden increase in the numbers of this particular species. I think why it gets used for this species is we have seen, to our knowledge, 3 times in recorded history when this has happened in the UK before. So the very first time that's written down was in 1899 and 1900, when there was a really sudden increase. Then again, 1932, 33, 1950, 51, and now this increase here. Now, it's interesting because back in 2022, fishermen off Cornwall started to catch more of these species than usual. And at the time, people were getting excited because they started to call it a boom or a bloom. But now, if you look at what happened in 2022 compared to what's happened last year, it doesn't even register. So I guess to put this into context, the commercial fishing landings of octopus, of the common octopus, also sometimes called the Mediterranean or European octopus, because that's its normal habitat. So the commercial landings last year were 65 times higher than the recent average. So since, say, between about 2017 and 2024, they were mostly seeing sort of between 20 and 30 tons of this octopus being landed. And last year it was over 2,000 tons. So that's why, it's not just an increase, it's a massive increase. And this is why we've used this term, a bloom.
So when you say that it isn't unprecedented and seen similar events going back over the century, well, maybe not similar as in from what you're saying now, what struck you most when you laid the historical records alongside what you're seeing now?
I think, one thing is that they are all quite similar in how they happen very suddenly. It's difficult to directly compare this bloom to the ones in the past because I think a few things. We didn't, in particular, they didn't keep such good records of, say, numbers, etc. So a lot of it is just descriptions of, fishermen having their, particularly crab and lobster fishermen having their pots raided by the octopus. Octopus even being seen inshore. Some of the ones in the past, they've seen them in rock pools, and really coming close inshore into harbours and things like that. Now, we saw some of that last year off the southwest coast of England as well. And so, the effects on the fishing industry have been very similar. The really sudden nature of it has sort of gone from just a few octopus to suddenly thousands in the space of like a month or two, is similar. And I think the other thing is, actually, when you look back at some of the descriptions from other places, we've seen this, like I call it a stepping stone of octopus increases. So they've had a bloom in, say, northern France, and then the year later they've had a bloom in the Channel Islands, and then the year after that we've seen it off the south coast of the UK. And that happened with this bloom. this ongoing bloom, and then also it's happened in the past as well. So it suggests that the same sort of environmental conditions are causing all of these blooms, and in fact, that's what we found.
What comes to my mind when you say that, just picture it, it's not a huge sea area apart, the parts that you mentioned geographically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when you actually look at it on a map, you're dead right. Like it's all in the same ICC area, for example. So,
Yeah,
in terms of fisheries management, but I guess in terms of the climate, they normally are quite different. The sea temperatures down in even in northern France are normally much warmer than here. But we can talk a little bit about the causes, I guess, in a minute. But yeah, they were all underpinned by unusually warm years, basically. All the blooms going back, even to 125 years ago, that was an unusually warm year for its time. So that's what's really key.
it makes it quite fascinating. Yes, we will be talking about it later, but I'm always not skeptical, but puzzled maybe when there's climate change is mentioned and warming temperatures.
Mm.
I just think maybe it's just been oversimplifying it. And I just think, well, if there's a lot of fish in the waters around Iceland in the winter, how on earth is there fish around Australia in the summer?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, each species is adapted to its own climatic envelope, as we
Okay,
call it.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I can talk more about the climate change
okay,
theory if you like. I mean, do you want me to do that now, or?
yeah, okay. No,
Yeah, so I think the thing is, so this is one of the questions that gets asked. It's like, okay, obviously climate change is happening now, and in the waters off the southwest of the UK in particular, we saw what is called a marine heat wave over most of the last 2 years. So think about a heat wave on land. It's when we have a sustained high temperatures for a period of days, and everyone knows about it, right? We all go out and buy fans or air conditioners, and we try and stay somewhere cool, and the equivalent happens under the water. But that's gone on, like I say, for most of the last 2 years, like on and off, for it to like technically qualify as a heat wave. There were times last year when the sea temperature was 4 degrees above the long-term average. Now, for sea temperature to be that much higher is extraordinary, because most marine animals, regulate their heat through the environment, the water that they're in. And so it's a bit like us getting sick and having a temperature, and so if you or I had a temperature of 4 degrees above normal, that's 101. We'd probably be looking at going into hospital. So that really changes what's going on in the sea. Now, I guess what we aim to show in the report is, yes, this has happened before, and it did happen when obviously 125 years ago we didn't have climate change, and in general the sea wasn't as warm as it is today. But the years both before the bloom happened and the year of the bloom were all abnormally warm for their time. And that's the really key thing. And it makes sense, right? Because this is a warm water species. It's much more common naturally in like around Spain, in the Mediterranean, across the north coast of Africa, much warmer conditions. But it is very adaptable. So there's always some here in the UK. What is different this time is that they've been breeding here, and so that has almost never been seen before, whereas last year it was seen literally dozens of times. So we've had lots of reports from fishermen of eggs in the pots. We've had lots of reports and indeed film from scuba divers of octopus mating. We've seen the eggs. We've seen now small baby octopus as well, coming up either in fishermen's catches or even being seen in the water. So I think that's the big difference this time is the bloom has happened. The reason it's so quick, I should have explained that, is this is a species that only lives less than 2 years, so sometimes only 18 months. So what happens is they'll they'll get together. The eggs that the female is holding are fertilized. They are then laid in a sort of a den, if you like, a small cave. And the female will guard those eggs, normally for a couple of months, and basically while they're developing. And then they'll hatch. And after that point, the female dies. If anyone's seen the film My Octopus Teacher, it's on Netflix, that sort of makes a big deal of all of that. So those baby octopus then are basically just drifting around in the plankton, and they can travel a long way. So again, the time they spend in the plankton is quite variable. It can be anything. At the absolute shortest I've seen measured is like only 30 days, but it can be 90 days. And so they can travel a long way in that time. And this is another part of what we found in this study is we'd seen this observation that you tend to see a bloom in France, a bloom in the Channel Islands, and then a bloom in the UK. Now, some people thought the octopus were physically moving. We don't have any evidence for that. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but no one's been able to prove it. But we do know those larvae are drifting in the plankton, and we ran these models basically and showed that indeed, in sort of 40 or 50 days, those baby octopus could move in the plankton in the ocean currents from Guernsey to exactly where they were found off the south coast of the UK this last year. And we also found evidence from this last year, because it's what we had the best sort of data for, was that back in 2024 and 2025, there were long periods of easterly winds. So these are winds that would have helped bring the baby octopus from places like the Channel Islands to the south coast. So I think for me, it's like, yes, warming makes these things likely, but lots of other things need to come together as well. It's like, you're putting it all in a blender and you're seeing what comes out, and sometimes it, it creates these blooms and other times it doesn't. But last year created those conditions. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, but I think you do see these sorts of like big shifts in weather systems sometimes. Um, and the earth goes through different parts of the earth go through phases that tend to stick around for a while and then suddenly change. So where I'm from in Australia, you probably heard about El Nino and La Nina, which are different phases of this climate system across the Pacific. And you can have it like, basically El Nino year is particularly warm and hot in Australia. We get lots of problems with droughts, bushfires, etc. Um, but then it will shift quite rapidly, like within sometimes a few months, and it becomes wetter and cooler, and it will stay like that for sometimes several years, and then it will shift back to the other system. Like, so, this is a feature of our climate. It's all connected around the world, but it's not it's not all evened out. There's systems that sort of reach certain tipping points and they'll suddenly switch in the other direction. And I guess to some extent, that's what we're seeing at the moment. But we seem to be seeing more extremes. Down here in the southwest of England where I am, I mean, we've had a crazy start to the year. We haven't had the cold like you guys have, but we've had, three named storms, I think, this year already. Flooding everywhere, lots of damage to houses and other infrastructure. Um, I mean, we'll wait for the analysts to look into how unusual this is. But from my experience, I've lived in the UK for 26 years now. This is pretty unusual weather at the moment.
One of the things that's making me think when you're talking about El Nino and the effects in the Lake of Australia, and that we have our two sons, one's in Australia and one's in South America. And in recent conversations, they're complaining when their Wi-Fi is and their signals are disrupted, and
Oh,
they
right.
lose signals. And it makes me think, well, for all they say about modern technology, It's not cracked.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's still affected by, these sort of large-scale atmospheric conditions,
Yeah,
for example. So, yeah, no, no technology is foolproof.
exactly. With Bloom, you've pulled together Fisher's reports, survey data, and modelling. If you had to be, I've asked you to be brutally honest, how confident are you about the scale of this bloom and where are the biggest uncertainties?
Yeah, so we are pretty confident of the scale and the distribution of where the sort of octopus really increased in numbers. And that has come together, as you mentioned, from fishermen's observations. So we actually surveyed about 40 fishermen across the south of the UK. So this included some from the Channel Islands, quite a few in Devon and Cornwall, most of them, and then even some from the Isles of Scilly as well. But then we've also got landings data resolved at quite a fine spatial scale from the Marine Management Organisation. I've also done a survey of scuba divers as well in the southwest. 120 scuba divers filled in our survey, and they've given their own observations, and they all match up. So they're all saying the octopus increased at this period of time. This is where they were found. And then more recently, things have been changing. So the octopus are still here, but and some fishermen are still catching a lot, but they're mostly catching them offshore in deeper water. And so this could be something to do with their breeding cycle, for example. So other octopus species are known to sort of migrate, inshore and offshore according to what's happening with their spawning. We're very confident that this is an extraordinary event. The evidence for that is overwhelming. We're very confident that it is where we've been told it is, because there's lots of different sources of information about that. We're pretty confident about what's caused it. So, like I say, we have analysed this bloom and all the other blooms, and they all have this consistent sort of environmental conditions behind them. In terms of whether it will continue or whether it will happen again, what we say in the report is that it's likely it will happen again in the near future. And I think, I can't be 100% right. And this is because, like I said, these blooms are not just about warming, they're about ocean currents. They're about enough octopus being in the right place for them to having enough food, all those sorts of things. But the situation we have now is that the water is much warmer than it was in the past. And so we're seeing more of these warm years underwater and in the air as well. And what we're also seeing, as I mentioned before, is a lot of breeding of octopus and appearance of these juvenile octopus. And fundamentally, the conditions off the south coast of the UK are now much more suitable for this species. So that's why I say the chances of it happening, either this one continuing, and maybe this species will stay here, high numbers for it might be here to stay, and it'll probably go up and down as you have good and bad years. And I think that's likely, but I can't be 100% sure. And if I'm proved wrong, so be it. But my job is to talk about likelihood, and I think it is likely they're going to do better here now.
When you were talking about the reports and the 120 scuba divers
Yeah.
and fishers, fishers were obviously a source of the early warning here.
Hmm.
Was their report broadly consistent, or were there really
Yeah,
disagreements?
no, there wasn't really much disagreement. And like you say, I mean, the first time I heard about this was, I think it would have been January last year, maybe February, early last year. A friend of mine, his dad's a crab lobster fisherman. And we were just, my friend and I, we were in the pub, and he's going, "Oh, have you heard about all these octopus the fishermen are catching?" And he showed me a picture on his phone that his dad had sent him, and it was an inkwell pot just stuffed full of octopus. And I said, "I've never seen anything like that in my life." And that was the point when, myself and a couple of colleagues at the University of Plymouth started talking about this. We said we really should try and do some research on this. This looks really unusual. And then as the next month or so went on, the fishermen started reporting this more and more. They started reporting it to the media. The media got interested. And then the fisheries minister at the time, Daniel Zeichner, came down to Plymouth in, I think it was May 2025. And I actually saw him at the end of the day as part of the research project we'd done on pollock, and he wanted to hear about that. But the first thing he said to me, me and my colleague Simon Thomas, he was like, "Please tell me you're not going to talk about octopus." He said, "That's all I've heard about all day." Because at that point, every fisherman that he'd met was saying, "We've got this situation, like, and you need to know about it, basically." And that was because they were just bringing up crab and lobster pots with just bits and pieces of, claws and carapaces, and really seeing their catches affected. Um, and then it was that day in Plymouth, I think, and the people that we spoke to, that led to this project actually happening. So it was ultimately funded by DEFRA, by the government, but also by Plymouth City Council and Devon County Council. And that was a bit unusual for those three to come together, but they all had concerns about the octopus bloom and wanted to better understand the effects it was having on the fishing industry and the causes and the possible future likelihood. So, yeah, that's how we got commissioned to do this work.
I would like to take it forward on the gear, but before we come to making, obviously, the whole subject, it must have everybody, as you're talking or you're reading your report, or that your mind is going and you're thinking of
Yeah,
so many different things. What I would like to ask you, to our listeners who'd be interested, when you're saying, right, I'm on this job, how do you focus on the, how do you focus on what you have to study for the report and not have
yeah,
opinions and
sure.
theories and that, and get that to say how it must be a real talent to be able to do the focus like you need to do,
I
and
think,
obviously have done by the look of the report.
thank you. I mean, look, it is a process. You don't just suddenly work it all out overnight. So I think the reason probably for those three funders getting involved originally was because of the effects it was having on the fishing industry. And so to actually sort of get a better understanding of that, how wide scale is the problem, what types of fishermen are being affected in what areas, how is that changing over time, all those things. So we knew straight away the only way to do that is actually to talk to fishermen. So, in particular, my colleague Simon Thomas, he used to be a fisherman himself, a commercial fisherman, and also worked on charter boats. So he lives in Plymouth. He has fantastic contacts across the southwest. He can speak easily to fishermen because he was one, but he also now has a doctorate in marine biology. And so he was really crucial, as was also the support of certain people in the fishing industry or who represent the fishing industry. So Beshley Poole from the South Devon and Channel shell fishermen, she's been absolutely fantastic. Originally, I was asked to come up with like a 2-page proposal, and that's what I did. And that was just focused on these three things. How unusual is this event? Why might it have happened? And what effects is it having on the fishing industry? And then working with the funders, we then sort of developed the proposal more. So they particularly wanted to know what might happen in the future, um, and then of course, like I'm working with other research partners. So again, this was the collaborative nature of this work was really important. So we had people like Tim Smythe and Molly James at the Plymouth Marine Lab, and they were the ones who had the expertise in gathering and analysing all the environmental data and doing the modelling of how the octopus might move in the plankton. Um, then others of us were sort of looking into the historical records. We had lots of people got in touch with me as well, I've found this old book from the 1930s, and it talks about this going on. So that was really fantastic. I mean, honestly, I think hundreds of people have helped with this work. Then we had other people, a team led by Emma Sheehan at the University of Plymouth, who has done work using baited underwater video surveys to try and get both numbers of octopus, but also to observe their behavior underwater. And that's been really interesting. It's been a real teamwork, and each of those team members also helped shape what we ultimately did, and we all sort of talked to each other. And we had this steering group that was made up of people like Beshley, but also people from the IFCAs, people from the Marine Management Organization, people from CFAS, some actual active fishermen as well. So I think, my job as the sort of project leader was to try and bring all this together into something cohesive. But then I was able to keep resharing it with the project partners, with the funders, and with the steering group. And so, ultimately, what you see in the report is the result of all of that. Lots of people helping us, guiding us, and hopefully we've produced something, that's quite useful moving forward.
The other thing which I'll be the first to put my hand up and say I'm maybe just trying to see things too simple, or it's the way my mind works. But and I'm sure you're going to say it's not as simple as that. But
Well, let's wait and see.
the other things I think when you say that is this is unprecedented this year. This bloom this year from the other times in history that you've researched. This must be the only time they've been caught at the level they're being caught just now. And the other thing that I feel, this is where I'm saying I may just be oversimplifying it. From the tonnages I've heard, boats landing, the bigger boats, as you say, out in the deeper water landing, is it an oversimplification to say they could fish it out?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. It's not completely unprecedented, as I said, because there have been these other blooms in the past, not many of them, but we think this one is as big and possibly bigger than the other ones. But it's very hard to compare because they didn't keep the same sort of detailed records. So I don't like the octopus were landed back in the 50s, for example, but we don't have any numbers for that. I doubt the same export market was set up that we now have. So almost all of the octopus that have been landed off the south coast of England have been exported to Europe, and that probably didn't happen back then. So it's a bit hard to compare, but we know that, in both cases it was something very, very unusual. In terms of and also, I think your point about the number of fishing boats that are out there, there's more now, probably in that part of the UK now. The observations of scuba divers, for example, they didn't exist. Jacques Cousteau was just trialing scuba gear back in the 1950s. So it was not something that was a weekend hobby for millions of people like it is now. So we do know just through the numbers of people, both on the sea and under the sea, we know much more. We're much better set up to observe things. In terms of fishing them out, I think, yes, there's no doubt that the amount that's being caught has had an impact on their populations. But you are dealing with a species that is incredibly productive if the conditions are right. And so that's why these sudden blooms have happened. So the species grows from an egg to potentially 10 kilos in weight, which is, sort of 4 foot long octopus in 18 months. That's a really big one, but definitely 4 or 5 kilos. And they have voracious appetites and they also breed, like they release tens of thousands of eggs. Now, obviously, a lot of those baby octopus don't survive, but even if a small percentage do, that's a lot of octopus. So I think you're dealing with a species that if it gets a strong foothold somewhere and and conditions are right, then it's going to keep producing more and more and more. And that's a question, if the octopus are here now, this species, there's always been another species, I should say, the curled octopus, which is a much smaller one. And that's more common here naturally, but that doesn't have the same commercial value. But if the common octopus is here now, we ask like the question, is it a species where we need to manage the fishery, or will environmental conditions sort of govern what happens? And that's an active debate. Other countries do manage their fisheries for octopus, mostly through things like closed seasons or pot limits and stuff like that. It's very hard to set a quota with any degree of certainty. But I think here in the UK, we need to see what happens next. And it's contentious because obviously some fishermen have been able to adapt, particularly the bigger boats, and do quite well. But there's a lot of small inshore boats that have not. And they are really suffering. And businesses have closed, boats are being sold. So, I imagine, not wanting to speak for anyone, but we have quotes in our report saying, we wish the octopus were not here.
Yeah.
We'd like to see them gone, basically. We want things back to how they were.
On the octopus, have they a predator?
Yes, and that's actually a really good and interesting point. So we have seen quite a lot of evidence of other species eating the octopus. So some really interesting examples, conger eels. So there's been also an increase in conger eels on the south coast of England over the last few years, possibly related to climate change, possibly not. That's sort of difficult to tell, but they are definitely eating octopus because we've seen conger eels with all the sucker marks on their heads. And of course, sometimes they're probably trying to catch them on the seabed, but if an octopus is in a crab pot, conger eels can easily go in and out of a crab pot. And if they can grab an octopus while they're in there, they're going to do it. But and then blue sharks as well. Again, we've seen. I work quite a lot with the catch and release recreational anglers who catch blue sharks. I've been sent quite a few photos of blue sharks with sucker marks on their heads and reports of them coughing up octopus when they come up. And then another interesting species is the Risso's dolphin, and that's normally quite rare in this part of the world, but last year there were lots of them seen. And again, there's good photos of them with octopus in their mouths, sometimes even playing with them, tossing them up in the air and things like that. So yeah, they have their own predators, and I think what we're seeing at the moment is almost like a rebalancing of the ecosystem. Yes, the octopus numbers have shot up, but now other species are moving in to eat them, and so at some point things will probably settle down a bit, but we'll wait and see.
It's fascinating life under the water because with the different species you're saying there with sharks, you've probably experienced this yourself, being like an Aussie. My son, who lives down in Australia, been there for 25, 26 years now. He does a lot of diving,
Okay.
and they were seeing sharks. And of course, he was a wee bit nervous and panicking. And
Right.
the guys with them were saying, you don't have to worry about the sharks. Would you? Now, you'll probably correct me here. It's either porpoises, dolphins, or something like that. And they were saying, they're in between us and the sharks. And if the sharks were to come closer to them, it's almost like punching, and they just go.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I have heard of that happening for sure, that dolphins will ram sharks. I think the main thing there is that, sharks very rarely attack people unprovoked. So obviously we've had, these fairly tragic incidents in Australia recently, 4 shark attacks in a couple of days and sadly one fatality. They're all thought to be bull sharks, which are known to be particularly aggressive, and they all happened in quite murky water. The most likely mistaken identity, but I've seen hundreds of sharks underwater over my years.
Yeah.
I've never had any like even look remotely aggressive towards me. Now, if it was a great white shark, yeah, sure, I'd be scared. That is a
Yeah.
impressive beast. I'd like to say I've never been in the water with one, although I'd love to see one, but I'd like to be in a cage. I did once come up from a dive with some friends in Australia. We were diving on a seal colony, which perhaps wasn't wise. And when we came up to the surface, our boatman was telling us quite enthusiastically to get into the boat because a great white had been swimming over the top of us while we were under the water. We never saw it, so that sent a bit of a chill. But again, we were in this very close to each other, and it did not bother us at all. So I think that's the main message there. I mean, shark attacks do happen, but they are very, very rare.
I thought you were very generous and kind in your comments there because when you mentioned the cage, am I right in saying you wanted to be in the cage, not the shark?
Oh yeah, please, yeah. No,
That
I would
was
love
very
to.
kind.
I would like to see a great white close up. It's on my bucket list, but I would only really want to see that one if I was in the cage,
Yeah,
not the shark. Don't want the shark in there with me. That's
that's
for
very
sure.
noble.
Yeah,
On the point you mentioned earlier about the effect it's having on some of the fitters, gear damage, and who cares for the cost, industry only, early placement. Before we go further into models and mechanism, we
Mm-mm.
talk about the practical realities where when octopus move in on this scale, they're not just eating shellfish, they're damaging gear, emptying creels, and costing time and fuel. From
Yeah,
what
yeah.
Fisher's told you, who is actually carrying the financial hit here, and does anyone in the system even acknowledge that cost?
I think it is. I mean, the people carrying the hit are the fishermen, right? I mean, because their catches are reduced. They're either losing income because they're not able to catch particularly intact crabs or lobsters, but in a lot of times they're just not catching much at all. And this is something I can remember years ago. I lived in Tasmania, and they have a very important. They call it the lobster fishery, but it's a crayfish. They're like a crawfish or a spiny lobster, and basically they had a bit of an octopus issue, but the main thing they had was the octopus would go into the pots, and then no lobster in its right mind would go into a pot that had an octopus in it, right? And so they would just often pull up pots that only had octopus and nothing else. You see the same with crabs and lobsters and conger eels, for example. Um, where I work up in Scotland, we often get congers in the pots, but there won't be anything else because especially if the conger went in there first. So the fishermen themselves, are the ones that are at the sort of front line. Now, obviously, fishermen are nothing if not adaptable, and many did adapt. In the Devon and Severn IFCA, they have an escape gap in pots to let out juvenile crabs and lobsters. And that became quite a problem for them early last year because the octopus were able to go into pots and then escape out of that escape gap. Because this is again is one of their incredible abilities is they can squeeze through a tiny hole. The only hard part in their body is their beak, which is like a parrot's beak basically. And so the fishermen, would sort of obviously highlighting this to the IFCA. And so they clarified that the deal was you could close that escape gap if you wanted to just catch octopus. But if you closed the escape gap, you weren't allowed to target crabs and lobsters. And so, fishermen I talked to or heard from, took different approaches. Some of them just went, right, we're just going to catch octopus, and they closed all the escape gaps. Some of them did it. If they put out a string of 40 pots, half of them had the gap closed, half didn't. Other fishermen actually tried octopus specific gear. So, you can find this stuff out nowadays on the internet, how to make an octopus pot. In other parts of the world, they use just very simple tubes because octopus love any kind of shelter and they'll go into that. And so I know at least a couple of fishermen completely switched what gear they were using and targeted octopus, directly. But not everyone could do that. And I think, from what we've heard, the fishermen, particularly in small boats, they were just not really catching hardly any crabs or lobsters. The crabs seem to have been the worst affected. So the landings of crabs in the southwest last year were about 50% down on the previous averages. Lobsters was about 30% down, and scallops also about 50% down in that region. Now, you can never be 100% sure how much of that is natural, how much is the octopus, but clearly the octopus are a factor. We know they're eating lots of all those species. And I guess the point of this report is to pull together all the information from different places and put that out there. And it is out there now. Like, apart from us writing this report, there's been a lot of interest in the media. It's obviously gone to the funders for them to decide what to do. And I know it's been raised in Parliament, like, only just a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, we wait to see what happens next.
Interesting. Yeah. A temperature versus everything else. Warm seas temperatures are, as you say, are central to
Mm.
your explanation. But are we at risk of maybe oversimplifying this by pinning it too heavily on warming alone?
Yeah, I think, like I said, warming is clearly important, and you wouldn't get this happening in a cold year. And what was thought to have been the case in the past is we have, had these really cold winters that you used to get, and they would effectively kill off the octopus. So we haven't had one of those for probably decades. Lots of people talk about the winter of '63. I was not alive then, but I know it's quite infamous. I did, funnily enough, live in London for a year when I was a kid in 1981, and I know that was exceptionally cold. So, but that's probably the last one like this. So I think it's temperature has to be warmer than usual for these blooms to occur. But just because the temperature is warmer doesn't mean they will, right? So it's not a guarantee. All these other factors need to come together. So I guess what we're saying is, with the warmer temperatures that we have now, octopus blooms become more likely. And then once they're here, they probably will stick around for longer than they used to, because we're not getting the cold winters. So, like I say, we've had all these storms here in the southwest over the last month, but the sea temperature is still unusually warm. It's hard to imagine at the moment in January or February, sorry, but the water's still warm, like warmer than it would normally be. And so that's really critical.
Indeed. Over half the fishers who you surveyed reported significant losses in crab, lobster, and scallops. Do you know whether
Mm.
this is temporary displacement or genuine stock damage?
I guess we don't know for sure. And what happens over particularly the rest of this year will be really telling, because there could be two things going on. One is actual reduction of stock, and I'm sure that's happened to some extent. The other thing, as I said, is the fact that the crabs and lobsters are just avoiding the pots because they've got octopus in them. And so there's probably a bit of both. So, we'll wait and see. I heard from some fishermen in France and said the lobsters, after the bloom subsided there, the lobsters actually did come back reasonably well. And that's what they thought was behind it, because previously they'd been avoiding the pots. But crabs, not so much. So I think we'll wait and see. With the scallops, we're very fortunate that CFAS, in collaboration with industry, does quite comprehensive surveys of scallop stocks. Now, they did some surveys in the area where the octopus were in, I think it was about May last year, and I have seen some of those results. And in certain areas, scallop numbers were definitely way down on normal. They'll be going back out again this year. So again, I think that will be really telling. If those numbers are still really down, that's a big problem. I think particularly for scallop fishermen, because you do not catch octopus in scallop dredgers. Like if you look at the overall landings, very few, a tiny percentage were caught in scallop dredgers. So whereas some of the potters, at least, not all of them, as I say, but some have been able to compensate by catching octopus. If you're a scallop dredger, then that's not happening. So, I can imagine that's been quite a dramatic effect. The bigger boats, we have a nomadic fleet of scallop dredgers around the UK. Again, this is just what I've been told, but apparently they came down in around May last year. They, within a few days, realized the catch rates were very poor, and so they moved on somewhere else. But if you're a smaller day boat, you just can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think that's where the crux is.
From the scallop dredgers I've spoken to, obviously Scottish, they've been getting scallops this year. We're only in our first month,
No, but
but
last year,
yeah,
yeah. Well, this is it. Like, so scallop stocks in other parts around the UK are pretty strong at the moment, but not in this specific area. And I guess that's one other thing to make clear is that where this is happening is a very defined area. So it's like basically from about, if you think, I don't know how well people know their geography, but Lyme Bay on the southwest. They're not really in Lyme Bay, but as you start to move west around Start Point, that's when the octopus numbers started to be seen more and more. And then they extended down really to the Lizard Peninsula. And so for a lot of the first half of last year, they were just in that area. As the year went on, some started to be seen off Penzance, and then eventually some on the north coast of Cornwall. But there's really a small area, and what is interesting is the previous blooms have almost all been in the same area as well. And so we think that's the combination of that is a warmer part of the ocean around the UK. It's probably the warmest area. But also, if you think back to what I was saying about modeling the transport of the larval baby octopus, when we ran our model, that's where they end up. They don't go into the North Sea. They don't go really around the other side. They just go on that specific bit of coast. So the other fisheries around the rest of the UK are not being affected by this.
to say winners and losers are always the case. Some fishers,
Yeah.
as you say, adapting and made money targeting octopus. Does that point to resilience, or does it just underline how uneven the impacts are?
I think it's a bit of both, if I'm honest. So, I think the fishermen who've done well, and some have done very well, we should be honest. Like, there was that very well known catch landed into Newland last year of 20 tons of octopus from 3 days of trawling, and that had a first sale value of over £140,000. So that's not bad for 3 days' work. And others have also done well. So I can't comment on individual boats, but I know some people have specifically gone, right, we are going to target octopus, and they've done well out of it. And they're the ones that have been able to, that, particularly some of the trawlers and some of the bigger potting boats have made that decision. So that shows their adaptability, their resilience to switch to different species. Obviously, there's no quota, there's no management whatsoever on this fishery, right? So you're allowed to catch as much as you can. So yeah, that does point to their adaptability. But then the fact that the others, mainly smaller boats, haven't been able to respond shows where the vulnerability is. And so, I mean, moving forward, that's my concern: is how are we going to support those boats? Because, I mean, I probably don't need to convince any of your listeners how important small inshore vessels are, not just for the fish that they land, but for the jobs and communities they support, and also the cultural and historical value of them, the character that they give to fishing ports. This is why tourists come to these cute fishing ports down in the south coast, is because they're full of little colourful fishing boats, so there's a lot of different values that are brought by the inshore fishing fleet. I'm involved in some other work specifically on that topic. So I do think it's really important that their needs are recognised and supported.
No, that's good that that's been considered. A lot of reports lean heavily on the word adaptation. There's an unspoken assumption that fishers should just adapt, change
Mm.
gear, target octopus, shift grounds, but adaptation costs money and carries risk. From
Yeah,
what's
and it's a whole. If you've been fishing for crabs and lobsters your whole fishing career, right? Possibly since you were a boy, or like that's a big thing to suddenly change to start catching another species. I'm trying to think of an analogy, but I always like to try and put myself. If I'm a scientist, academic, lecturer, etc. If I was suddenly told, "Oh no, we don't need that anymore, but you need to become a taxi driver or something," I'd be like, right, I don't really know the streets very well, or what it like. Do you know what I mean? It would be quite difficult. Yeah,
yeah,
I could adapt, but it wouldn't be easy.
from what you've seen, within the system, is it genuinely enabling adaptation or quietly selecting which parts of the fleet survive?
Well, I think there's a lot of people that know about these issues, and the octopus is just one of many reasons why the inshore fleet is struggling. I mean, going forward, we have this upcoming Marine Coastal Growth Fund that's is it 360 million over 12 years? Probably shouldn't talk about that in Scotland because I know Scotland's not doing very well out of it. But yeah, whether there'll be opportunities to bid for some of that money to adapt, I'm not sure. The details of that scheme have not been released. But we also have in England, we have the FAS scheme, the Fisheries and Aquaculture Support Scheme, and that does fund things like this. Like it helps bodies to adapt. And then you have other organizations. I think of in Plymouth, we have the Plymouth Fishing and uh, Seafood Association, who spend a lot of their time working out how to support the fishing industry and bidding for money, setting up different projects. And so it's there's not a simple answer, and I think it's good that there are some options available. But yeah, we wait to see how well it works.
Yeah. When you talk about better reporting and early warning systems, what's stopping that from already existing? Is it technology, governance, or just institutional, say, inertia?
I mean, to some extent, what was good was that it happened fairly quickly in this case. But what we'd like to see is, you can always improve schemes, right? So, like I said, I first found out about this by talking to someone in the pub. Well, that's not going to always happen. And then, of course, the fishermen raise the issues themselves. They do have to report their catches and landings through various catch reporting schemes. I think for the octopus in particular, it could be made simpler. That I don't know. We need to do some more research onto the best way. I could say, oh, we need an app that people can sort of report in, but then they don't want to have another thing to report into. They already have to report their catches. So I think it's a lot of it is about streamlining systems so that the information is accessible very readily. I used to work in the Isle of Man for quite a few years, and so I still maintain a bit of an interest in how they manage their fisheries and how they study them as well, monitor them. And they have, some fantastic systems for monitoring their catches where it's being reported in real time virtually. So the scientists and the managers can see what they're catching at the end of each day, and then they can, create the charts. And in that case, a lot of that's for scallops, but there's no reason why that couldn't be used for other species. And I guess just everything being a bit more efficient and a bit faster. I mean, we this is a project. I'll be honest. We worked pretty hard to turn it around as quickly as we have, but it's still a year since the bloom first started before this report is coming out. Now, part of that is because, like, it was we wanted to see how the year evolved, but still, I think being able to keep a better real-time eye on these things would be valuable.
In addition to that, given what you've seen, Bryce, should octopus now be treated as a species that needs proactive management rather than something that we just react to when it appears?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't think I have the answer yet. And I think a lot will depend on what happens over the course of this year. Like I say, if the numbers continue to be high, if all those young octopus that we're seeing are growing into adults and then breeding themselves, and this species is really established here, then I think we can start to think about management. And I know that there's a lot of different views on that. Like I said, some people wish the octopus were gone, and they would rather there isn't management, that we just fish them out, basically. I think that would be very difficult if the conditions are right for them. But B, with any sort of resource, whether it's fruit or vegetables or seafood, it makes sense to harvest it in a sort of methodical way, I guess. I mean, if you suddenly there's this huge glut of octopus on the market, you're going to see prices go down. So it depends what happens really with the populations. But if it is a species that's here to stay and that fishermen need to catch octopus to support their businesses, then there will be an argument to regulate the fishery. Absolutely.
Good. Is the bloom best understood as a warning signal, or could it still be a rare but natural oscillation?
Yeah. So it could have happened and then not be seen again for another 50 years, right? That's a possibility.
Yeah.
My I might end up with egg on my face in a few years' time, and that's all right. That's I'm prepared to put my sort of thoughts out there. I think it will become more common. Like, this is, based on all the evidence we have. Um, Numbers will probably go down again. It's being fished very hard, but then, again, when conditions combine in the right way, it'll probably go back up again. And I think that will happen, I'm going to say within the next 5 years, if not sooner. But we wait and see, right? I mean, like I say, I can only look at the evidence and talk about likelihoods. I'm not a betting man, but I'd probably put 50 quid on it happening again in the next few years, but I wouldn't put my life savings on it. Do you know what I mean? I'm not that confident. Um, but yeah, we wait and see. I think that's what science is about: gathering evidence to the best of your ability and then interpreting that to the best of your ability, but then also being happy to revise as new information comes to hand, as understanding builds. And that's what we will do.
You're the horse racing equivalent of top tips.
I don't know about that. No, please, I'm not encouraging gambling, just so you know. I was just trying, that was the best analogy I could think of.
That's a good one. Yeah. If sea temperatures continue on their current trajectory, how likely is it that blooms like this become a regular feature rather than a historical curiosity?
Yeah, I guess I kind of answered that in the previous question. So
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
think it's pretty likely. And I guess the other thing which I sort of forgot to add was we are seeing other changes, right? And obviously, a big one is bluefin tuna that really started to become more and more common about 10 years ago. That's no doubt a complex story, part fisheries management, part response to food availability, but also climate change. But there's some other changes that are going on that are not so obvious. So there's been big changes in the plankton over the last few decades. There's a little species of fish called a comba or a coma, depending on how you pronounce it. It's a small grouper, basically. It's the only grouper that is in these waters. It only gets to probably not even 20 centimeters. So you might think, well, what's the big deal? But these are voracious predators, and I used to study this group of species on the Great Barrier Reef for my PhD, and they particularly eat juvenile fish of other species. So, this is a little fish that you rarely catch it on a rod and line, But you talk to scuba divers and you look at pictures that scuba divers are taking, and they'll show you this species is really like it's had its own bloom. It's just like it's not as big and obvious as an octopus. So then you start to ask yourself, well, what's that going to do to the ecosystem? And if it starts eating lots of juvenile fish of other species, is it going to change the dynamics of other things that we like to catch? And there's a lot of these little changes. I mentioned Risso's dolphins becoming much more common, particularly last year. What's that going to do? Now, and all these things have potentially good and bad outcomes. Risso's dolphins, I could see the wildlife tour operators being really happy because now we can take people out and look at those. Obviously, bluefin is supporting both a commercial and a recreational fishery. I've been told the catch rates for bluefin tuna off the south coast of England are the highest in the world for bluefin tuna for recreational fishermen. And it's all catch and release. It's all very carefully done. But that's bringing a lot to the economy. So, yeah, we have to be careful not to overuse adapt, but that is what we're going to need to do. And we're already needing to do. And to some extent, we are doing. And so I think just bear that in mind that the ocean is changing.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Is there a danger that events like this get folded too neatly into a climate narrative when the real issue might be our lack of adaptive fisheries management?
Uh, that's a hard one to say. I don't think it's not down to fisheries management because this species has bloomed predominantly for environmental reasons and some sort of chance combinations of conditions as well. So, like I keep saying, it's not that simple. It's not just because it's gotten warmer, but without the warming, it wouldn't have happened. So, I think that's the best way to look at it. And so we do have conditions now that will make these sorts of things more likely, and other changes, other increases in warm water species.
Yeah, indeed. Sort of coming to sort of close on it. If you and I were having this conversation again in 5 years, what indicators would you want us to be paying attention to now?
Okay, yeah, it'll be interesting to have this conversation in 5 years, and I'll find out if I've got egg on my face or not. Um, yeah, I mean, look, there is enough information out there for us to know what will have happened in the meantime. We do have good landing statistics from the Marine Management Organization that continues to improve. There's still some issues. One of the problems that I've had in analyzing these data is that often I said there's another species, the curled octopus and the common. If you put them next to each other, they look completely different, but they still get often confused in the official statistics. The common octopus just gets called octopus, and you don't know which one it is. That makes it difficult to monitor exactly what's going on, but we have a good enough idea. And then, of course, we'll have the observations of fishermen and divers and other people. So we'll know what's happened. We'll have pretty good records. And certainly from my point of view as a scientist, I'm hoping I get to continue to work on this species because it is fascinating. It's both important, um, but also scientifically interesting, and I think it can serve as a model for how other species respond to climate change and how we adapt with that as well.
Is there any evidence, Bryce, that that's happened with other fish species? Do they cannibalize?
Yeah, so the octopus definitely do eat each other, and that's been seen certainly in crab pots, but it's also known from the wild from other observations. And I think particularly if you had ones of different sizes, uh, they're difficult to study, but we do know it happens. And so I guess, yeah, that's something to consider. But normally, and there's so many strange things that we're learning about octopus, right? And the common octopus is the best studied octopus species in the world, mostly not here because it's common other places. But I think one of the most fascinating but also worrying observations was that quite a lot of shell fishermen, so crab and lobster fishermen, reported scallops in their pots. So shells and sometimes live scallops. And sometimes, from looking carefully at their photos, you can see bits of flesh still attached to the scallops. So they were recently killed, right? And these are not the scallop disco pots with lights in them that attract scallops. These are just regular crab and lobster pots. And one fisherman got 40 shells out of a single pot. Now that's extraordinary. And they also have told us about like their pots being filled with rocks and other dead shells and bits of kelp and all sorts of stuff. So the only explanation for this is the octopus are actually going and catching scallops and other things and putting them in the pots to save for later. And so they see the pots as like their den. And that's why they go into them in the first place quite often. So they're storing stuff in there. They don't realize that the next day or two they might get pulled up and taken and, harvested. So this is like, just try and picture that for a minute, like this octopus, walking around the seabed, grabbing a few scallops, going back, sticking them in the pots, and then it seems like overnight they'll just sit there and feast on them. And this is what they would do in their natural dens, which are mostly made out of little caves and ledges and things like that. But they've interpreted the pots as being the equivalent. And so this is a very strange behavior, but it works for the octopus unless it gets caught, obviously.
It almost gets to the stage when it sounds alarming. You might say waking up, because I should have maybe been thinking of that before, but from the things you've mentioned now, cannibali, they've got their own natural predators,
Mm,
and but they just and sorry, what I was going to say, and fishers are catching them in large quantities now,
mm.
but they just seem to keep coming.
Yeah, I mean, look, one thing that really surprised me, and I expect others, was in August and September, the catches really started to drop off. And, when you look at other countries, they mostly have a summer fishery. So the numbers build up during the year. They get lots of them over summer, and then they start to die off. And that would make sense because basically, as well as being caught, they're breeding, and then both the males and females die after they've bred. So when I wrote the first draft of this report, that's what we thought had happened. And then, we, in response to feedback, like we worked on the report some more. And in the meantime, suddenly the catches of octopus went up. And so in November, they actually caught the most tonnage of octopus of any month last year. And even in December, there was still a lot were caught. And that was a complete surprise, certainly to me. I did not expect that to happen. From what I understand, it was fishermen working offshore in deeper water, so it was some of these large crabbing boats and some trawlers. And so, yeah, despite how heavily been fished, despite probably them being eaten by other species, there was still lots of them left at the end of the year, and they're still coming through. And this is where octopus are a bit different from a regular fish sort of fish species breeds like early in the year. Then you start to see the young in like spring and early summer. And then, so you get what we call a year class. So if you're looking at monitoring cod or bass or something like this, you see these different sizes of fish. And this is a 1 year old, this is two, etc. And it starts to blend. But with octopus, they breed for about 9 or 10 months of the year. So you don't really see that. They're just constantly producing new octopus, basically. So that means if conditions are right, the populations are constantly being replenished. And that's very unusual. You don't see that in any fish species that I know about.
No, I take it they're not a shoaling species.
No, and this is the thing, like They're normally quite solitary, and if you and each one has its den where it will go to sort of shelter overnight or perhaps to store its food, etc. But two things, I guess, and again, we can't explain all of this. One is that I think the most I've heard of is 12 octopus in one crab pot. Like, what is going on there? And that's when they start to eat each other. And then also, I've seen footage from a diver, and he's basically sitting on the seabed and spins around with the camera, and you can see 5 octopus all within his field of view, all sitting about a meter or two apart. That is not what is expected because they're thought to be a solitary animal. Now, maybe they were undergoing some sort of breeding aggregation. We don't know. But there's lots of stuff we don't understand. Yeah, still figure out.
When you, I'm just trying to make some sense of it. When you see 12 octopus, say, in one pot, do they know if it's all the same species of octopus? And
Yeah, these
could,
are all
could,
the same.
could
Yeah.
one be a predator for the other? Then that's what's attracting it into the pot.
I think so. I mean, that's my kind of theory is maybe if there's a few of them and then like they start fighting, which they would do, trapped in a pot together, and one of them gets killed, and that's kind of releasing a scent into the water, which encourages more to come and sort of starts off this chain reaction. That's all I can think of. And yeah, I think the cannibalism is probably much more likely in pots than in the wild, because in the wild they would generally avoid each other, but if they're all in a pot together, they obviously can't escape.
Yeah. What's the one thing policymakers, fishers, or the public most often misunderstand about the octopus bloom?
Gosh, that's probably not for me to say, but I think it's been interesting that there's been so much interest from many different groups of people in this octopus bloom. You know, the media have obviously covered it extensively. When I meet people that are not other scientists and I tell them that I'm doing work on octopus, that they just want to know about it, you know. And obviously, I think for the fishermen, this is such an unusual thing. So if you think about the fact that 75 years ago was the last bloom, there would be very few, if any, fishermen alive or still working who experienced that last one. So, you know, you'd have to be probably nearly 90 and still fishing. There's probably a few people alive who remember it, but 75 years ago, you know, it's such a long time. So the vast majority of fishermen have never seen anything like this. And I think they're probably a little bit spooked by it and a little bit like, what is going on? Like, when will things go back to normal? How long will that take? Like, there's so many unknowns. And I think, you know, and when there's lots of unknowns, people, yeah, kind of try to figure it out, and all sorts of interesting stories get out there. But I don't think I'd point at any one thing.
Okay. No, it's not maybe reasonable to just pick on one thing and when something like that, especially when you're telling me how many years it's gone on.
Well, it's been a long time, and I think the only thing I would say that often gets misunderstood is the fact that this is actually a native species to our water. So we hear a lot about it being an invasion or a plague, and it's like, well, no, it's normally here. It's normally rare, but it is normally here. And so the difference is just we're seeing a huge increase in numbers rather than an invasion. The movement of them, you know, some people have speculated that they've been moving huge distances. You know, I've seen even people saying they've come from Morocco and places like that. That's, yeah, very, very, well, near, basically impossible. But it's not impossible that they've moved across the channel, but we just don't know if that's the case or not, because there's not been any movement studies that have shown anything like that. They're hard to track. Normally, with a fish, you'd put a tag in it, and somebody catches the fish somewhere else. Then you go, oh, okay, it's swum. You know, where I work on sharks, and some of them have been moved across the whole Atlantic Ocean. with an octopus, you put a tag in it, it's going to pull the tag out because it's got 7 other arms. We can do that. But we are using things like acoustic tags, which are actually inserted into an animal's tissue. There have been some studies with those, but mostly they've been quite small scale. And so as a result, they've said, oh, the octopus don't move very much. But this is something we're really keen to do. So the people at the University of Plymouth have over a number of years now have been working with other European partners to put lots of receivers all through the channel to track lots of different fish and shellfish species. So if we could put some acoustic tags in the octopus, then we'd really be able to, know for sure if they move these long distances. And I think that would really help understand what's going on.
Oh, interesting. When fishers suddenly see ecological changes like this and feel ignored and the science catches up, what does it do for trust in management and science more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess it's not for me to talk from the perspective of the fishers here, but, one of the positive things about this project was it was put together quite rapidly and it was really put together in response to the concerns of fishermen. And so, I'm pleased that we've been able to do that. And I've talked to representatives of the fishing industry and, they're pretty happy with the report as it is. So that's really nice to know. And so this is the first step. We've put the information out there. Now it's down to others to decide how we're going to adapt. I think I'd like to see more work on, our focus was mostly on fisheries and biology and that sort of stuff. There's probably a need to look at more closely at the economic effects. I'm not an economist, but to really get a handle, like I've said a lot of times, some fishermen did well, some didn't. To really put some numbers on that and to find out for those ones particularly who have struggled how much it's affected them and what their future looks like. I think that would be valuable because then you could target
Yeah,
help more effectively.
indeed. You got me remembering something, Bryce, and I don't want to spoil things for you, but you mentioned tagging.
Yep.
It's not 100% foolproof. There's a
Oh no.
story from up our way. Hey, I'm not telling tales. It was over 50 years ago. Well,
Yeah.
well, maybe not over 50, but certainly between
A
40
long
and
time ago.
long time
Yeah,
ago.
yeah,
And this
yeah.
this fisherman was fishing. He got a tagged cod,
Mm.
and it was a big, really good sized cod, and they were expensive at the time. And he was for put it to be when they got a tagged fish, they would send it away to the marine
Yeah,
laboratory,
yeah.
and they would get 10 shillings, which
Okay.
in our term would, although it was a bit more
It's
then.
worthwhile at the yeah.
So he told one of his crew it would be better if he put it into a smaller fish, on just take it off and put it onto a smaller fish,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
and he would get the more money for the bigger one on the market. And so that's what happened. Eventually, he got a letter from the Marine Lab. This is a true story.
Yeah.
He got a letter from the Marine Lab thanking him for sending the tagged code, and there were some things really incredibly interesting about it.
Yeah.
One, that it had shrunk from when it was tagged, it had lost weight, and it had changed sex.
I think that's a subtle way of the scientists saying we've caught you out here, but we're not going to specifically tell you. Yeah, look, I mean, I think the lesson there is not to make too much of single observations. I've heard of similar sorts of stories. Yeah, during my PhD, there was a friend of mine was measuring the movement of coral trout, which is a grouper, sort of species that doesn't get any bigger than a meter, quite a big fish. But he was using radio tracking. It was quite a new technique at the time for fish. And so this involved basically going out in a boat with an aerial and following these things around. And, I was up there and he came back from his day at sea. He was so excited. He's like, these fish are incredible. They just like are swimming all around the island and they're going over to the next island and coming back again. He said, who knew this little fish would swim so much? And so then he went out again the next day and he was following the same fish around. And a certain point, a great big fin broke the surface. And he realized the coral trout that he had tagged was actually inside the stomach of a shark. His supervisor then told him to catch the shark because these tags were very expensive, but he didn't have any luck. So, you got to just, a lesson I've learned as a scientist is sometimes just to like pause, reflect. If you see something really unusual, it's probably wrong. There's probably an explanation for it.
Yeah, I bet you.
There you go.
The other thing I would say you've done for me today, an old saying my father used a lot, and I've got a modernized version of it now. Anytime he would hear, just say, a group of MPs or that talk, arguing, any people like that, a body of people
Right.
arguing at each other, he used to refer to them. They're like ferrets in a sack.
Right.
That
Yeah.
was the term he used.
Okay.
I think we could now use like octopus in a pot.
Oh yeah. Well, the official phrase for a group of octopus is a tangle.
All
So you
right.
have a school of fish, a tangle of octopus. So there you go.
Oh, brilliant. Bryce, how can our listeners follow you and get your report on the octopus bloom?
Yeah, sure. So our report is actually on the website of the Marine Biological Association, but you can also find me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. I'm Bryce Stewart, so it's a unusual name in these parts anyway. So there's not many of us in the world, I don't think. So if you just Google my name, you'll find me. I mean, particularly on LinkedIn, we've been sharing a lot of news about this report. We produced the full report, which is 100 pages. It's quite heavy, but
Wow.
we also have a summary report of specifically on the effects on the fishing industry. That's only about 6 pages. My wonderful colleagues at the Marine Biological Association have made it look nice and colourful, lots of lovely photos. So, yeah, that's also very accessible.
And where do you go from here with it? Is it like you started the report, you're finished it, and so you're out, or is there an ongoing situation?
Well, there's another part to the project. So we've been doing surveys. We did these baited underwater video camera surveys last year. That it only takes a few days to put all the cameras out. It takes many hours and days and months to analyze all the video. That's now
Yeah.
been done. We've also been doing trawl surveys through the Marine Biological Association. We have these sites that we've been monitoring since 1911, and so we're going out again, hopefully in the next few weeks, to redo those to see if we pick up any more octopus. The observations from the divers, we have only just really summarized those, so we're going to analyze those fully. And so we've got another report coming in a couple of months. And then, yeah, like I say, I mean, at the moment, I'm not sure where this work goes, but I'd love to keep working on octopus. It's been fascinating, and I think also, an important piece of work to be involved in as well.
Well, that's fantastic. The only thing that asks the question, if you were in one of your local restaurants and octopus was on the menu, would you have one after all the work you've
Gosh,
done?
That's a difficult question. I have eaten octopus, but I'm a bit conflicted about it. You know, if I see them underwater, they are fascinating and magnificent creatures. Um, but yes, I have mostly overseas. But yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm a bit conflicted about that. I mean, look, the thing is, octopus, they are an important contribution to fisheries, particularly in other parts of the world. You know, there's some, for example, areas in Africa where it is a crucial part of their fisheries income. So I think, yeah, going forwards, we need to understand more about the fisheries. But in those places where it really is important, then those fisheries do need to be managed and managed sustainably. So yeah, I think there's a place for it. But I'm still, a little bit conflicted myself. But yeah, I have eaten them before.
Well,
They're
that's
quite
been
tasty.
excellent. That's brilliant, Bryce, and I'm pleased to hear that we're going to hear more about it in a future report.
Yeah, we'll
So,
do.
well, maybe let's look at that one then. So, just
Okay.
thank you very much, Bryce. A really fascinating subject, and credit to you. A brilliant report and very
Thanks so
thorough.
much.
You've done a great job. Well done.
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, that thanks should go to all our research partners and all the people who've helped us, who've funded us, etc. Because, like I say, this really has been a team effort, and I'm just proud to be part of it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.